In the weeks following the firing on Fort Sumter in April 1861, that began the American Civil War, both North and South resounded to the music of marching bands and the tramp of feet, as everyone flocked to the colors, convinced it was a lifetime's opportunity not to be missed. Everyone believed, too, that it would soon be over, settled no doubt in a single, gallant, and hopefully bloodless encounter, and then they could get back to living again. For each side was sure, of course, that it would win. The generals pondered their strategy, each hoping to have the chance to bring success to his section of the now divided land. No one then had any idea of the enormity and tragic nature of the struggle upon which they were embarking. The green hills of Vermont, close to the Canadian border. Northerners living here could not have been further away from the arguments over slavery or from the prattlings over secession. So why did they go to war? Northerners were as righteously devoted to their way of life as were Southerners to theirs. Theirs was not a life, though, based on lush plantations and masses of slaves. Few in the North had any direct experience of slavery. People here favored small communities, free labor, the right to better oneself. Why then should they support a military struggle to coerce back into the Union rebel states which had been a thorn in their flesh for many years? Why did they rush now to take up arms against the slave South when they had for so long been reluctant to translate their disapproval into direct action against it? Southerners grossly underestimated the devotion Northerners had to their own ideas of freedom, as well as their deep pride in the Union. People here resented the threat to their way of life, which they believed the Confederacy posed, and Sumter confirmed their worst fears.
Why the North went to war is, in my opinion, one of the basic unanswered questions, or that is to say, it has not really been answered completely satisfactorily, despite all the volumes of history written on this subject. It's much easier to understand why the South seceded, that Lincoln's election represented a potential, if not immediate, threat to the institution of slavery. I think to understand the North's reaction, you have to then go back and look at the ideology of the Union, the ideology of democracy, the notion of a future greatness for the American empire, as they called it, the nationalism, and the fear of the country being balkanized into a number of competing smaller nations. There were those, as you know, Horace Greeley and others, who said, erring sisters, go in peace, let them go. There were abolitionists who had urged the breakup of the Union before the war. But I think Lincoln very cleverly maneuvered the South into a situation where it fired the first shot. And this led to a feeling in the North that the South was the aggressor, the South had attacked the Union, and considerations like peaceable secession sort of were swept aside in a wave of patriotism, probably somewhat like the impact Pearl Harbor had later on. Once you are under attack, then the response of fighting back seems to be overwhelming.
Within the day of Sumter's surrender, Lincoln summoned into Union service thousands of militiamen to suppress the South's rebellion. Touching and tearful farewells became the norm as Northerners answered their president's call. The sounds of recruiting rallies filled the air. "So impatient did I become for starting," said one volunteer, "that I felt like 10,000 pins were pricking me in every part of my body." The choice of color for their uniforms, rather than the prospect of terrible carnage ahead, occupied the minds of the new soldiers and their families. Lincoln's problem, though, was getting these troops into Washington. Rumors were rife of a coup attempt against him.
Here you have this new president, a minority president, just come to Washington in a difficult time, and he's fully aware that the United States regulars number no more than 14,000. And of course, most of them are not in the East, they're out West, defending us, in quotation, against the Native Americans or Indians. So he arrives in Washington, he has 653 men to protect the district, and he wants to get Northern troops into Washington as quickly as possible. But when the first troops try to make the change from stations, in those days we didn't have monopolies, and so therefore you had to get off of one train station and then you had to get yourself somehow 3 miles to another train station. And in this progress from station to station, the Baltimore mobs pick up the bottles and the stones and they hurl them against some soldiers who begin firing, and as a result, the first casualties of the Civil War take place in Baltimore. And Lincoln was very worried about what this meant.
Lincoln was worried about many things in those early weeks of the war, but raising recruits was not one of them, as the state governors vied to exceed their quotas. More men offered their services than the authorities could easily handle, let alone equip and uniform. Patriotism quickly became the mood in the North, as it had been in the South for many months. Lincoln relied on ships for getting his troops into position around his capital, with the railways blocked in Baltimore and elsewhere in Maryland. The North's greater resources in this, as in most other things, were to stand it in good stead in the coming struggle. Even so, Washington's garrison was at first so puny that the White House had to rely for its defense on civilian volunteers. And this at a time when the front line was the Potomac River itself, since Confederate Virginia lay just across it and was in full view of the White House windows. Fortunately, the threat of such an invasion was not a real one at the war's outset, though the measures taken to discourage it were not impressive. But the capital's defenses soon took on a more solid look. As well as facing rebel Virginia across the Potomac, Washington was surrounded on the north by Maryland, a slave state whose loyalty to the Union was unsure. Lincoln also worried about the other border slave states, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri. Tennessee had already opted for the Confederacy, but he was determined to win it back.
No general in modern times had ever conquered a territory as large as the South. The South didn't have to win in order to win. It could lose every battle in most campaigns, and if the North just got tired enough of fighting and quit, the South would win. It wasn't threatening to just do anything to the North. It just said, we want to be left alone. If we punish you enough, you'll leave us alone and we'll go our way.
The North intended not to leave the Southerners alone, but to bring them to their senses by depriving them of outside help and by impressing them with the Union's resolve to end their rebellion. Meantime, the gaily colored uniforms belied the serious nature of the military preparations. While the North knew that in order to win, it had to defeat the South in battle, the Confederates wanted a delay while they sought foreign recognition, which they believed would convince the North to accept their independence. Washington was soon surrounded by tents. Unlike the South, equipment was never to be a problem for the North. Its greater resources and easier access to foreign suppliers gave it an edge from the start. The North, too, had almost a 4-to-1 advantage in white manpower. As the summer wore on and discipline within the camps relaxed, the onus was on the North to make the first move. The problem was that life under canvas was beginning to take on a separate existence. Food was always in good supply on the northern side, though the diet of fatty bacon and hardtack became fairly boring. The Confederate soldiers, on the other hand, often went short. One thing that was to have a considerable impact on the war was photography, then only 20 years old and still a matter for experts.
There was one basic process used worldwide, and that was called the wet plate process. It gets its name because the glass plate negative actually had to be damp in order to be light sensitive. So the photographer had to actually have a darkroom wagon with him on the spot. He had to make the negative, expose it, and develop it all within about 10 minutes before that plate dried. Now, it's a very, very cumbersome process, but there is absolutely nothing primitive about the results. The photographs, in fact, are superior to a lot of what is taken today. You had two main popular forms that Civil War photographs came in. Probably the most popular of all, and this was for studio portraiture, was the carte de visite. It's a French word. It means visiting card. These became popular in the United States in 1860, and they very quickly attracted a great deal of attention. They were relatively inexpensive. They could be mass-produced. They were very convenient to send through the mails. And in 1861, when the soldiers go off to war, more had their portraits taken as carte de visites than any other form. And very quickly, people realized that these things would fit very nicely in albums, so you had a sub-industry created, and that is the carte de visite albums, and you'd have pictures of your Uncle Harry and your grandfather, and also your uncle who was in the service. And the photographs were very, very important to the servicemen and to the families back home. Now, as far as field photography, battlefield photography is concerned, the stereo view was king. These three-dimensional stereo views were produced in large quantities. I would venture to say that of the actual battlefield outdoor series that were recorded, 75% were originally taken with the twin-lens stereo camera. And if you've never seen an original Civil War view in 3D, it's very dramatic. And the stereo view was for the Civil War populace what TV is for us today.
Adjacent images seen through a special viewer produced a three-dimensional effect. Newspapers and magazines could not reproduce photographs then. They relied on woodcuts based on those images. But collecting such photographs became enormously popular. Sets of them were sold through print shops and photographic galleries. The most famous being Matthew Brady's in New York, who was responsible for many of the more important Civil War photographs. His team covered the battlefields from the northern side. By the time of the Civil War, some 3,000 photographers were making a living in the United States. One of the first things soldiers did on joining up was to have their photographs taken for friends and family at home.
The most moving photos are those, I think, of the young men going off to war, particularly in 1861, when no one had any idea of what this experience was going to be like, and they all expected a summer's lark.
The summer's lark was about to end and the real fighting to begin, though the Union soldiers' families did not look at it that way. They expected the coming battle to be a bit of a lark, too, and stayed on to watch. Many of the men had only volunteered for 3 months and wanted some action before returning home. Indeed, had expected the war won by now. Northern public opinion had been demanding revenge since Sumter, and once the Confederacy had the nerve in June to move its capital to Richmond, a mere 120 miles from Washington, a clash was inevitable. Both sides moved up their guns, eager and confident. The cream of Washington society rode out as if for a picnic to see the rebels get whipped. Ordinary folk came too, convinced it was an opportunity of a lifetime. Some brought their black servants. No one was barred. All believed the war would be won by nightfall. July 21st, a Sunday, was when the North felt ready to strike. Ground sheets in hand, the crowds hurried for the best view. Generals' wives, congressmen, even a member of Lincoln's cabinet. Manassas, 25 miles south of Washington, was the place chosen for the first battle. The French-style Zouaves from Louisiana rushed to the Confederacy's defense. The North's move had hardly been concealed. They had taken 3 days to get into position. Any hope of surprise was lost. In their keenness to be as close to the action as possible, some of the picnickers had located themselves right in the path of the Federal advance and had to be persuaded to move. For most taking part, it was their first battle. The Union Army was easily the largest one ever seen in North America. Outnumbered, the Confederates were pushed back. Casualties were heavy on both sides, partly because the soldiers were inexperienced. The intense July heat did not help either. 22,000 Confederates were opposing 35,000 Union troops, twice as many as George Washington had led against the British at Yorktown during the War of Independence. The rifles the infantrymen had were much more accurate and could be reloaded much more quickly than the muskets of old, hence the greater casualties. The battle ebbed and flowed across the rich Virginia farmland, with the troops trampling underfoot the crops ready for harvesting. Few generals on either side at this stage of the war realized the enormous impact the new rifle would make. Just as the Union troops were beginning to tire, many of them had not eaten or drunk anything since early morning, the Confederates, unbeknownst to them, switched fresh troops by train from the Shenandoah Valley. This was to make all the difference, though the North should have been aware of it. The many-colored uniforms on both sides led to tragic confusion when, at a critical moment in the battle, some Northerners fired on their own men dressed in gray. Thereafter, blue became the standard Union color. The battle was America's most costly to date. 1,200 would die and another 3,000 be seriously injured. Onslaught followed onslaught against the Union positions. For the first time, Northerners were experiencing the rebel yell, a high-pitched wailing scream delivered on the run. Said a Federal soldier, "There is nothing like it this side of hell." Since the infantrymen had to bite open their own cartridges, strong front teeth were essential. By late afternoon, many Northern soldiers had had enough and began to withdraw. Sensing victory, the Confederates pressed home their advantage, and soon the Federal retreat became a rout. Though weary, the Southerners fought on. The roads back to Washington became cluttered with fleeing civilians as well as panic-stricken troops. The Northern retreat was dubbed later the Great Skedaddle. For a while, Washington seemed wide open, but the rebels were not sufficiently organized to follow up their remarkable victory. Many on the Southern side would rue the missed opportunity of Manassas forever. For the North, Manassas was a harsh awakening. Talk of a short war disappeared. It now knew it had a proper fight on its hands. For the South, a breathing space had been achieved in which to seek foreign recognition through the playing of the cotton card.
As part of the sense of self-confidence that the Southerners felt, they believed that cotton ruled the world, in fact. The British economy would collapse without cotton, and therefore the British government, to protect itself, would intervene on behalf of the South. France would do the same. Of course, this was totally false. There was no reason why the British economy could not keep going without cotton. As a matter of fact, what had occurred was that the crops had been so enormous for such a long period before this that there was an oversupply within the British warehouses. So the British didn't have to face this problem.
They attached too much importance to cotton. At a time when England was developing its own short strand cotton in India and other parts of its empire, the South either did not realize this or would not accept it. And in other words, by 1861, Southern cotton was no longer king. The South did not know this.
Southern cotton filled a need in England, but not enough to prompt military intervention. Besides, she was enjoying a profitable trade with the rest of the United States, which she did not want to damage.
At each point that the English were tempted, especially in view of the fact that it appeared that the North was losing, they drew back. For example, Gladstone, at one point in the summer of '62, made a speech in which he said, Jefferson Davis has made an army, he's about to make a navy, and what's more important, he's made a nation. Well, those were fighting words in the North, and there were rumors that England was about to recognize the South. But Palmerston is just not willing to risk it. The instinct was to delay. And my feeling is, unless Northern armies were fairly decisively beaten, there was no one with a sufficiently strong vested interest to intervene.
It was on the high seas where Britain and the North almost came to blows over the Union's efforts to deny the South foreign supplies. No matter how hard the Northern sailors tried, the blockade was never wholly effective. During the first year of the war, 9 in 10 Southern boats got through. While the Union crews got bored watching the entrances to Confederate harbors, the captains of the blockade runners, many of them British, got rich trading in luxuries that commanded premium prices in the South. To make the blockade stick, the North expanded its navy and sought safe havens along the Confederate coastline as supply bases for its gunboats mounting guard. In this way, they would not need to return home so often for refueling. Although armored ships were coming in, the most common were still wooden sailing vessels. Despite the cocky air of some Union sailors, living conditions on board were unpleasant, especially on the armored vessels, which were hot and humid. Moreover, short spurts of activity were followed by spells of acute inactivity. Doggedness was the key requirement for the Northern blockading fleets, all part of Lincoln's scheme for wearing the South down.
There are those historians, for example, who suggest that the South should have concentrated more on raising or breaking the blockade. I don't think that this is true. I think that using the naval vessels for defensive purposes was exactly the way they should have been used. And keep in mind that most of the major ports within the South remained open until close to the end. I'm speaking in terms of Wilmington, of Charleston, and Savannah, and Mobile, and Galveston, Texas. And in all of these but Galveston, Texas, they had significant naval forces that contributed to the defense of those harbors. The only vessels that they actually had at the beginning of the war were a few steamboats, a few vessels that could be converted into warships. So they had to initiate a shipbuilding program to build warships, which they did. Ultimately, they built or converted over 100 warships.
But the boat that was going to make the difference in the naval war was the ironclad, and in this, the North was to have the edge. Called monitors, they were among the most bizarre sights of the age. A tin can on a shingle was how one contemporary derided them. The precursors of these had first appeared during the Crimean War some years before. Their significant feature was armor plating. The French had set the pace in their development, with the British some way behind, and the United States nowhere. Now the conflict between North and South was to become a test bed for this revolution in naval warfare. The South was off the mark first when they modified a wooden hulk named the Merrimac, which caused havoc among the blockading fleet near Norfolk, Virginia in early March 1862. By coincidence, the North's first monitor reached the scene the very next day, and the first clash between ironclads began. For 4 hours, the two latter-day sea monsters threw everything at each other in one of the most unusual maritime combats ever witnessed. But the shots simply bounced off each other's armor plating like peas from a pop gun, as one observer wrote. Since action photography had not been developed then, painters and engravers had a field day, as indeed they did at every major Civil War engagement. It was not just the Atlantic coastline that saw such clashes. By far the most important took place on the rivers of the West, particularly the Mississippi and its tributaries. Here, New Orleans is falling to Northern gunships. Coupled with the capture of Fort Henry on the Tennessee River earlier in the spring, the Union plan to drive the rebels from the Mississippi Valley had begun well. Taking the Confederate fort here at nearby Donelson on the Cumberland River was more difficult. It was better sited on higher ground, and its guns wrought havoc for a while on the Union fleet steaming against it. But the Northern troops, commanded by a certain Ulysses S. Grant, who had come overland from Fort Henry, surrounded it and compelled its surrender. When the local Southern general asked for terms, Grant replied, "Nothing except unconditional surrender can be accepted." The victor instantly acquired the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. The loss of New Orleans, the South's largest city that controlled the mouth of the Mississippi, was a bitter blow, but the capture of the twin forts of Henry and Donelson opened the door to an invasion of the Confederacy's heartland.
It set the tone for what was going to happen in the West. It marked the emergence of Grant and incidentally of Bedford Forrest. And it was the South's last chance to get Kentucky, which was very important. Lincoln himself said, "I hope God is on my side, but I must have Kentucky."
The Union forces under Grant were now free to move down the Tennessee River towards Mississippi proper, reaching here at Pittsburgh Landing during March. Confident they had the Confederates on the run, they did not bother to dig themselves any defenses. But the rebels planned a counterattack at a little-used Methodist meeting place near the river called Shiloh.
The Battle of Shiloh started on the morning of April the 6th, 1862, about 2.5 miles to the southwest of here. Confederates attacking the Union forces and forcing them in this direction. During the morning, the battle went the way the Confederates wanted it to. They continually pushed the Union forces back. Finally, about 11 o'clock in the morning, the Union forces, a portion of them, dug in this area, which is the Hornet's Nest. We're actually standing in the sunken road, which borders one edge of the Hornet's Nest. The Confederates, when they hit this area, attacked across this open field and through the woods behind me. The attacks started about 11 in the morning and they lasted until 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The commander in this area, the Union commander's orders were, hold your position at all costs, stop the Confederate attacks. The Confederates attacked 11 times, but they were never able to break the position. They finally brought up a battery of artillery, which started bombarding this area, pinning the Union forces down. This allowed the Confederates to move around them and surround them. However, the Union troops had done their job. Grant was able to build a defensive line back at Pittsburgh Landing, 2 miles to the northeast of us, and stopped the Confederate advance on the 6th. And on the morning of April the 7th, reinforced by Buell's Army of the Ohio, he moved out, forcing the Confederates to withdraw back toward Corinth.
Such was the ferocity of this battle that more men died than in all the previous wars in which America had been involved. It had an enormous impact. Wrote the poet Herman Melville, "What like a bullet can undeceive?" Shiloh was also the first Civil War battle to have a ballad written about it. In no other war in American history did music play such an important part.
Come all you valiant soldiers, a story I will tell about the bloody battle that was fought on Shiloh Hill. It was an awful struggle and will cause your blood to chill. It was the famous battle that was fought on Shiloh Hill. It was the 6th of April, just at the break of day. The drums and fifes were playing for us to march away. About the hour of sunrise, the battle it began. And before the day had vanished, we fought them hand to hand. The wounded men were crying for help from everywhere, while others who were dying were offering God their prayer. Protect my wife and children if it is thy holy will. Oh, such were the prayers I heard that night on Shiloh Hill. and early the next morning we were called to arms again. Unmindful of the wounded, unuseful to the slain, the struggle was renewed and 10,000 men were killed. This was the second conflict of the famous Shiloh Hill. Before the day was ended, the battle ceased to roar, and thousands of brave soldiers had fell to rise no more. They left their vacant ranks for some other ones to fill, and now their moldering bodies all lie on Shiloh Hill.
Shiloh was a bloodbath.
Shiloh was an incredible battle. There's never been any wildest dreams by anyone that there could be anything like that. Shiloh was like Waterloo, and it came out of nowhere. It was just all of a sudden, there's a huge battle. Before that, there'd been Bull Run and Wilson's Creek, but they were skirmishes compared to Shiloh. And of course, Shiloh was followed very shortly by the 7 Days in Virginia, also a huge thing. And the realization that they had stepped into this buzzsaw must have been a terrible shock to everyone, soldiers and civilians alike. The losses were huge, of course, and they realized, and both sides had to say, oh my God, what are we in for? But both were determined to go on with it. It wasn't a question of stopping. It was a question of realizing how much blood was going to be shed. On the eve of Shiloh, there was a Confederate congressman who offered to mop up with a handkerchief all the blood that was going to be shed in the whole war. He didn't think it would come to fighting. It was also a common opinion that one Southerner could whip 10 Yankee hirelings. That was corrected at Shiloh, too, if it hadn't already been corrected at Donelson.
Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, scene of bitter Union upsets. Despite successes elsewhere, the North was doing disastrously here in the East. The Southern armies relied for their food on this rich valley near the Appalachian Mountains. The breadbasket of the Confederacy is how some described it. The Union was determined to deny that succor to the rebels. But although outnumbering them by more than 4 to 1, its attempts to do so were thwarted, and the federal capital, a mere 60 or so miles away, was on occasion threatened. Barely 3 months after Manassas, the North had suffered another humiliation at a place called Ball's Bluff, just across the Potomac above Washington. The fiasco seemed to suggest that the Union troops, in the East at least, were still not quite ready. That winter, the Army sat it out around Washington. The popular song then on both sides was All Quiet Along the Potomac, the words by a Northern woman and the music by a Southern man. During the lull, the camp photographers went to work. In the spring, Lincoln prodded his generals into action. Instead of doing so head-on, as at Manassas the previous summer, they preferred now to outflank the Confederates by shipping their troops down the Potomac to Fort Monroe, where the Federals retained a foothold. Richmond was only 70 miles away. But once the 100,000 men got ashore, they had to besiege one Southern bastion after another. The numerous creeks the Union troops had to cross delayed progress, too. The rebel river batteries foiled a more direct approach. Following a demonstration in Washington by a scientist-cum-showman called Thaddeus Lowe, Lincoln sanctioned the establishment of a balloon corps, which saw action in the Richmond campaigns. The balloons seldom went higher than 300 feet, which allowed the observer to see for 15 miles in every direction, and they were linked to the ground by telegraph. Flights at dawn were preferred. Not only were air currents then usually favorable, but the intelligence gleaned from the location of campfires and the early movements of patrols could be most valuable. After bitter fighting, the Union forces by mid-May had pushed to within 5 miles of the Confederate capital. Panic seized the rebel leadership, but the Southerners fought back gallantly and halted the Northern advance at terrible cost to both sides. 11,000 casualties in one day, including the Confederate commander. His replacement now planned a counterattack at the point where the Union troops were most stretched and caught them on the hop. During 7 days of sustained fighting, some of the fiercest of the whole war, the Confederates forced the Northerners to retreat. The Richmond battles had an enormous impact on public opinion. The carnage was appalling. More than 30,000 died or were severely wounded. To Lincoln's great annoyance, the Union troops withdrew the way they had come. The victor was a certain Robert E. Lee, who had been the rebel replacement. He now became the North's bogeyman and the South's eternal hero. He had set in train a dramatic turnaround in the fortunes of war. A second confrontation at Manassas produced an even greater humiliation for the Union than before. Realizing that a Southern victory on Northern soil might tempt the British to intervene and persuade the Yankees to sue for peace, Lee crossed the Potomac west of Washington and invaded Maryland, aiming to get behind the federal capital, but was halted along Antietam Creek. The ensuing battle on September 17th should have seen the end of Lee, since not only had a quarter of his men dropped out through fatigue, but he himself had been injured and could not ride his horse. In addition, plans for the dispersal of his forces fell into Northern hands. For days, the creek at Antietam ran red with American blood. It was the bloodiest single 24 hours of the whole war. Those who took part did not realize how much hung on the battle's outcome. Britain had been poised to recognize the South, and a Confederate victory here might just have clinched it. It might also have dampened the North's enthusiasm for continuing the war. But for those who fell amid the wheat fields, then as now ready for harvesting, such matters were beyond their ken. Caring for the injured so taxed the local communities that the area became, according to a visitor, one vast hospital. A federal officer walking the fields the following day wrote, "No matter in what direction we turned, it was all the same shocking picture, awakening awe rather than pity, benumbing the senses rather than touching the heart." Said a British military observer, "In about 7 or 8 acres of wood, there is not a tree which is not full of bullets and bits of shell. It is impossible to understand how anyone could live in such a fire as there must have been here." Within just 5 months of Shiloh, the war had escalated alarmingly. Where would it all end? Many were now wondering. Some of the bitterest fighting occurred along an ancient sunken road, immortalized in this painting by a survivor of the battle, James Hope from Vermont. It has, perhaps inevitably, been known ever since as Bloody Lane. The Confederate dead lay 3 deep for half a mile, mowed down, in the words of their commander, like grass before the scythe. Since so much had depended on the battle's outcome, Southerners were naturally disappointed and wanted to know what had gone wrong.
What went wrong for the South at Antietam was quite simple. The Confederate Army was considerably smaller than the Northern Army. And the Northern Army had found secret orders that the Confederate commander Robert E. Lee had issued to his troops. And so to the east, at South Mountain, the Federal troops came pouring across, and General Lee had to rapidly unite his troops. He determined to fight. He was confident in his army, and he lined them up along the banks of this creek, convinced that he could stop General McClellan's blue forces. He did stop them in the sense that the Confederates were not driven back, but his army was so desperately blooded that even though he'd achieved a tactical stalemate, strategically it was a defeat, and he had to move back across the Potomac River into Virginia.
Antietam was not just the bloodiest day in the whole Civil War, but the bloodiest too in American history. 8,000 lives were ended here, and another 18,000 severely wounded. The casualties were 4 times those the United States suffered on D-Day in World War II. Entire units on either side were virtually annihilated. But Antietam was notable also for the advent of the professional war photographer.
When the war began in 1861, mentally photographers saw covering a war as basically going to camps and taking very static groups of posed soldiers. In 1862, at the Antietam battlefield, this all changes because for the very first time, led by Alexander Gardner, you have photographers actually covering a battlefield before the ugliest scars, in other words, the dead soldiers, were buried. And these were very, very dramatic photographs. And the American public had never seen war depicted with the realism of Alexander Gardner's Antietam series, where you have bloated corpses, dead horses, etc. This series created such a stir that it was given more media attention than any other series before or after Antietam.
People were not used to seeing photographs of violent death. Lincoln went to Antietam after the battle principally to press his commander, General McClellan, into pursuing Lee. But the Northern generals were now much in awe of Lee. Lincoln, however, took the opportunity of the Antietam stalemate to issue his Emancipation Proclamation.
I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States of America and Commander-in-Chief of the Army.
Lincoln had realized he needed to counter the move within Britain towards recognizing the South after the Union's second defeat at Manassas. The proposal he had in mind was freedom for the slaves in the Confederacy. When he had informed his cabinet of this earlier, they persuaded him to delay announcing it until success came in battle.
Is or may be suspended or disturbed.
Lincoln morally detested slavery, there's no doubt about that, but clearly saving the Union was his ultimate priority. He said in 1862 in a famous public letter to the New York editor Horace Greeley that his foremost goal was to save the Union. If he could do it without freeing any of the slaves, he would do it. If he could do it by freeing all of the slaves, he would do it. If he could do it by freeing some of the slaves and not others, he would do that.
It was a crucial thing to do in military terms because as Union armies were advancing, they faced major problems of what do you do about fugitive slaves who come to the Union lines? Are they to be treated as slaves and sent back to their masters, which in fact was done in the early days of the war? Are they to be kept as contraband of war? Can they be enlisted in the Union Army? On the other hand, what is to be done about black workers who are in effect supporting the Confederate Army in the field? Can we strike at them in any way? Can we at least psychologically undermine that underpinning of the Confederate Army? All these were going on together. Now, in saying this, I'm really not trying to argue that Lincoln was not morally opposed to slavery. He was. He always had been from very early days. But he also said from the very beginning that he was making a distinction between his personal preferences, meaning his own moral judgment, and what he could do as president. And he did not think he could emancipate until it became a military necessity, as it so clearly did in 1862. Therefore, military necessity coupled with political necessity, coupled with the need to forestall foreign intervention, all these reinforced Lincoln's moral desire to work against slavery in whatever way was permissible for the President of the United States.
At that point, it became a war between slavery and freedom. It became very, very difficult for the British to countenance recognition. I would say that Antietam is the decisive moment in the war.